Hello, Adam. Nice to see you again.
Good morning. You too.
Excellent. Um, the high street, the death of the high street. I mean, seem to have been talking about this for years and years. What's the difference now?
Well, clearly the pre-pandemic situation was a gradual erosion of the financial viability of physical bricks and mortar retailers. And I think we need to be a little bit careful around the term high street. I would broadly refer to that as all retail, because of course the larger malls are also suffering horribly as well. And again, we're beginning to feel the chill wind of the online proposition long before the pandemic came along. Clearly, what has happened is that in the very similar way to the asteroid striking the Earth and sorting out the dinosaurs, along came COVID and really had an absolutely devastating impact onto what was an already rather troubled sector. So here we are now with many of our biggest retail names now gone, and quite a few of the others facing what can only be described as an extremely uncertain future.
Yeah. I mean, given the range of investment vehicles that have a stake in, we'll call it the high street, but as you say, it's really sort of bricks and mortar retailing. Many of us are sort of tied up in this through property portfolio investments and pension scheme investments, etc. What's the sort of knock-on effect of all of this?
Well, that's right. And it needs to be understood that this isn't a kind of victimless shift. All of us who have money in pensions, for instance, or ISAs, or are a member of a final salary pension scheme arrangement, will likely have some exposure to commercial property, and a considerable amount of that, both through pension and non-pension collective investment vehicles, will be retail space. And clearly, particularly for pension investment professionals, they were rather dependent on these healthy rental streams to pay pensions to those who were in the decumulation phase. That is going to present problems to a lot of fund management groups.
All right. So in terms of sort of protecting their investments, what on a broader sort of societal level, if you will, what can be done to revitalize or protect these areas in because this is great chunks of our inner towns and cities.
That's right. And I genuinely think the time has now come to get a lot more creative about this. And the truth is that bricks and mortar retailers have been calling for fairness around taxation, for instance, between online retail and bricks and mortar retail. I personally don't think that is doing anything other than particularly rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I think the problems are much more systemic than that. It make them probably feel a bit better, but the reality is, I think the switch to the majority of us now doing some or all of our shopping online is an irreversible trend. So what do we do with all that space? What can it be turned to usefully that is of some benefit? And the reality is, as we've observed before on previous Tab on Money episodes, adversity of this sort can sometimes be turned into a positive. And I think if we set our minds to this, we could probably do some pretty good stuff. The reality is that we have a significant housing crisis, which has not gone away through the pandemic, and the government has committed to large numbers of affordable housing being built. And as a result, they are doing sometimes some unpopular things, such as rolling back greenbelt protections and so forth. At first glance, it would seem obvious to me that many of these now effectively defunct retail units, whether they're malls or high street properties, could be repurposed to provide high quality, affordable housing at much lower cost than a ground up build. And in many cases, they actually enjoy far better communication facilities, bus rail links, or physical locations already in the centre of town, which would make them a pretty logical and vibrant community in their own right. And I think, particularly as far as the high street is concerned, and the high street is a phrase which implies community. I think having a higher degree of residential population on or close to the high street would have an immensely beneficial effect on the feeling of community within those towns, and would undoubtedly herald the return of smaller retailers which had hitherto been squeezed badly, such as your independent greengrocers and fishmongers and butchers and coffee shops and these sorts of things, where people will now realistically be within walking distance. So I think there is a real opportunity to re-engineer and repurpose this enormous portfolio of currently rather compromised real estate.
I mean, I know that we shouldn't always look, and certainly don't want to always look to the government to stick their fingers into this, but do we think there are some initiatives the government could take to help encourage, especially as we think that younger people are the ones who really find it most difficult to get onto that property ladder? What can we do to encourage both the people to move back into the cities and use up that pre-existing real estate without wrecking the green belt, etc., and get onto the property ladder?
I think we first of all have to look at who are the stakeholders in this. This kind of utopian dream that we're discussing is fine, but actually there are various barriers to making it real. The first is obvious. Planning consents specifically around conversion to residential from retail would need to be made much more easily attainable. But there are more nuanced things around this as well. A lot of these units are owned, as we've discussed just now, by specifically property funds, and a property fund operates to a mandate, and those mandates are pretty clear, and they can't, without effectively breaking their regulatory permissions, they can't step away from that. So you can't take a commercial property fund and then have it investing heavily in residential property without somebody getting into trouble with the regulator and so forth. So that needs to be thought through carefully. And I think some government encouragement around regulatory flexibility and the legal position of the fund managers would be necessary to make this viable. Otherwise, it just ticks the too difficult box. So those are things that big government can get involved with. It doesn't really address the issue of affordability, however, and lots of people, as we know, still struggle to accumulate a sufficiently large pot of cash to be a realistic deposit. We have for some time now been advocates of allowing first-time buyers to accumulate their deposits within their pension fund, simply because depending on the type of pension you have, money grows within a pension, both tax-free and with employer contributions frequently, and a contribution from the government if you're in a stakeholder scheme. Anyway, that initiative allowing people to accumulate funds within their pension pot, combined with all the other interventions, would make this, I think, probably a realistic proposition and address long term this issue of crisis in the high street and crisis with housing. And it's not without precedent. Let's not forget that the government intervened heavily at the end of the Second World War in a desperate need to house hundreds of thousands of returning armed forces. They embarked on a huge program of constructing decent quality but low cost housing, prefabricated houses all over the country, many of which are still in occupation now. I mean, they're actually quite well put together. And that was just sheerly a matter of political will. And I think this is an opportunity where political will could actually bring about a really rather positive transformation in our housing landscape and make the remaining physical retailers, bricks and mortar retailers, give them a far more secure foundation.
Yeah. Well, that's all interesting stuff and well worth further thought. I think the Prime Minister has drawn some connection between the Second World War and the current pandemic situation. So maybe the time is right to have some bold thinking on this. Thanks for your time, and we will catch up again soon.
You're welcome. See you soon.